Before there was light, there was only darkness. Not the soft and gentle darkness that comes after a day of sunshine, but a deep and endless night, stretching without beginning and without end. The sky was an empty blanket of black, heavy and silent, with no moon to soften its face, no stars to guide a wandering traveler, no dawn to promise a return of warmth. It was a world hidden in shadow, a land where all things moved slowly, listening more than seeing, touching more than knowing. The oceans rolled in obscurity, their waves rose and fell, yet no sparkle danced upon their crests. The great waters breathed like a sleeping giant, sigh after sigh, but they shone with no reflection. The mountains stood tall, yet they were invisible to the eye, their peaks swallowed by the endless black. Forests spread their branches outward, but no sunlight touched their leaves, no morning painted them with color. The rivers wandered across the land like forgotten serpents, their waters cool, their voices hushed, their surfaces dark mirrors that gave nothing back. And the people of the earth, they lived carefully in this darkness. They built fires, small flickering islands of warmth and flame. Around those fires they gathered, close, for beyond the glow lay only the unknown. They learned to move by sound, by memory, by the feel of the earth beneath their feet. They hunted by silence, listened for the stir of deer in the grass or the ripple of fish in the streams. Children grew up never knowing the sight of their own faces, never seeing the sparkle of their eyes in daylight. To them, the world was shadow and whisper, and every step was touched by mystery. Animals, too, lived differently in this eternal night. The wolf padded across the moss, its ears sharp to catch the faintest rustle, its eyes gleaming but unseeing of distance. The deer stepped gently, relying on the smell of damp leaves, the brush of grass against their legs, the direction of the wind. Birds rested in the branches, folding their wings close, for no horizon called them into the sky. They sang sometimes, but their songs were faint, lost in the vast black. And yet, life endured. Seeds pushed their way through soil, not with the guidance of the sun, but with the memory of growth locked within them. Roots stretched, rivers flowed, the sea breathed, storms gathered and broke. The land did not end with the darkness, it simply waited. The world was alive, yet incomplete. It had rhythm, but no color. It had breath, but no warmth. It had voices, but no sight. Among the people, stories began to form. Stories told in low voices beside the fire. They said there was light hidden somewhere in the world, a brightness stronger than any flame, something that could lift the veil of darkness. Some said the light lay buried in the belly of the mountains, guarded by stone and earth. Others whispered it rested beneath the oceans, guarded by spirits that did not wish to let it go. But many believed otherwise. They said that an ancient man, old and cunning, held the light captive. In his dwelling, he kept it sealed in boxes, one within another, hoarding it jealously, refusing to share it with the world. And so the world remained shadowed, the forests heavy with shade, the oceans blind and vast, the skies endless in their emptiness. Children dreamed of brightness, though they had never seen it. Hunters dreamed of paths lit clear before them. Mothers dreamed of seeing their children's faces glowing in warmth, but it was only dream. Yet, in this world of silence and shadow, there lived a being unlike any other. A creature with feathers black as the void itself, but when he moved, they shimmered faintly, like oil upon water, catching hints of colors unseen. His eyes were sharp, restless, always searching, always curious. His wings stretched wide, and with each beat he stirred the air into life. He was Raven. Raven was clever. He was mischievous. He was both trickster and teacher, both wanderer and watcher. Where others saw only darkness, he looked for secrets. Where others accepted silence, he listened for hidden songs. He had flown over mountains invisible, sailed on winds that whispered, rested in forests where the leaves hung heavy. He had seen the people, the animals, the waters, and he knew something was missing. The world was alive, yes, but it was not awake. It breathed, but it did not shine. And Raven, restless in his feathers of night, began to wonder, where was the light the story spoke of? What secret was being kept from the earth? Who had stolen the fire of the sky? And why was the world denied its glow? So Raven began to watch. He flew quietly over rivers, listening to their hushed currents. He perched upon mountain ridges, staring into the vast unseen horizon. He walked among the people's villages, watching the way they huddled close to their fires, the way they whispered dreams of brightness, and listened to the children laugh and the mothers soothe them in the dark, and in his chest a strange stirring began. The people longed for something more. The animals longed for it. Even the trees, stretching upward with blind patience, seemed to yearn for it. And Raven, clever and curious, felt the yearning as his own. Then, one night while resting upon the crooked branch of a cedar tree, Raven heard a story that made his feathers tremble. A group of elders sat around a fire below, their faces faint in the glow, their voices slow and rhythmic. They spoke of the old man, the ancient one who lived far away in a house hidden among trees. The old man had a daughter, beautiful and kind, but the old man himself was secretive. In his dwelling, they said, he kept a collection of boxes, each smaller than the last, each hidden inside another. And in the smallest of all, the light itself was trapped. The light of stars, the light of the moon, the light of the sun, all sealed away. Raven tilted his head. He listened, feathers rustling faintly. If the elders spoke true, then the world's longing had an answer. If the light was truly kept by the old man, then perhaps Raven could find a way to set it free. For the first time in the endless night, Raven's heart beat with more than curiosity. It beat with purpose. And so, beneath the sky of unbroken black, Raven spread his wings and rose into the air. He would search for this house, for the old man, for the boxes of light. He would find what had been hidden, and perhaps, just perhaps, he would change the world.
Raven flew for many days across the vast, shadowed world. His wings beat steadily, carrying him above forests that stretched endlessly, over rivers that shimmered faintly in the darkness, across valleys wrapped in mist and silence. The world below him was alive, but without color, without radiance. The people still gathered around their fragile fires, their faces half hidden in flickering glow. The animals still moved cautiously, guided by scent and sound rather than sight. And always, above it all, the black sky pressed down, heavy and eternal. Raven's eyes, sharper than any creature's, searched for signs. He had heard the elder's story, the old man, the house, the daughter, the boxes. Somewhere out there, hidden among the shadows, was the place that held the world's missing light. Raven's heart, restless and cunning, would not let him forget it. He flew low over the treetops, scanning the forests. The cedars rose tall and dark, their needles whispering secrets into the night air. Pines reached upward, their branches tangled like the fingers of giants. The ground beneath was thick with moss, soft and damp, glowing faintly with the breath of earth. Raven landed often, pausing to listen. He listened for voices carried by the wind, for the crackle of hidden fires, for the sound of laughter that might lead him to the old man's dwelling. At last, after many days, Raven's keen ears caught something different. It was faint, a low hum, a rhythm that seemed out of place in the silence. He followed it, hopping from branch to branch, gliding short distances through the still air. The sound grew clearer. The crackle of wood, the murmur of voices. Through the trees, he saw a faint glow, not the harsh light of day, but the small, controlled glow of a fire. There, nestled among towering trunks, was the old man's house. It was not grand or majestic, but it was built with care. The walls were made of wood, smooth and strong, fitted tightly together. The roof was covered with bark and branches, heavy with moss that gave it the look of being part of the forest itself. Smoke drifted lazily from a hole in the roof, curling into the dark sky above. The house sat quietly, as though it had grown from the earth rather than being built upon it. Raven perched on a nearby branch, watching closely. He saw the old man step outside. His hair was long and white, his back slightly bent, his eyes narrow and sharp. In his hands he carried a wooden bowl from which he drank slowly. He moved with the patience of someone who carried many years, each step deliberate, each gesture thoughtful. Behind him, the door of the house opened again, and a young woman stepped into the night. She was his daughter, as the stories had said. Her hair fell long and dark, her face soft and gentle. She carried water in a clay vessel, moving with grace as she poured it carefully into another bowl. The firelight touched her features, making them glow faintly against the endless dark. Raven tilted his head, studying them. The old man was stern, secretive. The daughter was kind, innocent, but Raven's eyes were drawn to something else, inside the house. Through the small opening of the doorway, he glimpsed the faint outline of objects stacked upon each other. Boxes, wooden, carved, polished. They seemed ordinary, but Raven felt it in his feathers, in his bones. These were the boxes the elders had spoken of. The light was inside. He ruffled his wings, excitement coursing through him. If he could reach those boxes, if he could open them, the world would change. But how? The old man guarded his house carefully. He was wise, watchful, and full of suspicion. No stranger could simply walk in. No trick could be played so easily. Raven would need patience. He would need cunning. He would need a plan. So he waited. Night after night, Raven perched nearby, watching the house. He saw how the old man rose each morning, moving slowly about his tasks. He gathered wood, fetched water, sat long hours beside the fire. He saw how the daughter tended the home, cleaning, cooking, humming soft songs to herself. Raven listened to her voice, gentle as a stream, and something stirred in him. Not just curiosity, but a strange affection. He also watched the boxes. They were never far from the old man's side. Sometimes, in the quiet of night, the old man would sit near them, his hands resting upon their lids, as though reassuring himself they were still there. He would not open them, not yet, but Raven could feel the power within them, pressing outward, yearning to escape. The more Raven watched, the more restless he became. The world needed what was inside those boxes. The people, the animals, the forests, the seas, all longed for light. But the old man kept it hidden, locked away, selfish in his guardianship. Raven's sharp mind worked constantly, searching for an answer. And then, one evening, he saw a way. The daughter stepped outside, carrying a clay jar of water to the stream. She knelt to fill it, her hands moving gracefully in the dark. The surface of the water rippled, catching faint reflections of the fire from the house. Raven watched her closely. She was kind, trusting, unaware of the great secret her father held. If Raven could not reach the old man, perhaps he could reach her. An idea formed, a trick, clever and daring. Raven, after all, was not only wise, he was a trickster, a shapeshifter. He could become what he needed to be. And so, with a flutter of feathers, he rose into the night sky, circling once above the forest. Then, folding his wings, he dove into the shadows of the trees, seeking the stream where the daughter knelt. Above the water he hovered, then let himself fall. His body shimmered, feathers dissolving into mist, wings melting into vapor. By the time he struck the surface of the stream, he was no longer Raven. He was a single drop of water. The drop slipped into the jar the daughter was filling. She did not notice. She lifted the jar, carried it back to the house, and drank from it. And so Raven entered her, hidden, invisible, his trick complete. In time, the daughter grew with child. The old man was surprised, puzzled, but he loved his daughter deeply and accepted the child she carried. And when the day came, she gave birth, not to an ordinary boy, but to Raven in human form. The child was strange from the start. His eyes were bright and curious, sharper than any child's had been. He laughed often, but there was mischief in his smile. He was restless, crawling toward anything forbidden, pulling at boxes, playing with lids, reaching for things he was told to leave alone. The daughter loved him, and even the old man, despite his sternness, grew fond of the boy. But the boy had a hunger, not for food, not for play, but for the boxes. Inside those boxes, he knew, lay the stars, the moon, the sun. Inside those boxes lay the future of the world, and he would find a way to open them.
The boy grew quickly, faster than the old man expected. His laughter filled the house, bright and unpredictable, echoing in the wooden walls like a melody. Yet his laughter always seemed to carry a secret, as if behind every sound he knew more than he showed. His eyes sparkled with mischief, sharp and curious, forever moving toward things hidden, toward lids that were kept closed, toward doors that were meant to stay shut. The old man, though stern, loved his grandson. He carried him in his arms, fed him warm food from carved bowls, and sat him by the fire on cold nights. He taught him small lessons, how to tie knots, how to carve wood, how to sit in silence and listen to the forest. Yet the boy's attention always drifted back to one thing: the boxes. The boxes sat in a corner of the house, stacked neatly, one upon another. To anyone else, they might look ordinary: polished cedar, bound with fiber, lids fitted tight. But the boy, who was Raven in disguise, felt their weight not in his hands, but in his heart. He could sense the power within them, pressing against the wood, straining to be free. At night, when the fire dimmed and the old man slept, the boy would crawl quietly across the floor, reaching small hands toward the boxes. His fingers would trace the grain of the wood, his ear pressed against the lid, listening. Sometimes in those quiet hours, he thought he could hear something inside, a faint hum like 1,000 wings, a shimmer that wanted to become sound, a glow that wanted to become sight. He would sit for long minutes, breathing slowly, imagining the world if these boxes were opened, if the light was released. But the old man guarded them fiercely. When he saw the boy crawling near, his voice grew stern, his brow furrowed. "No," he said, "these are not for you. These are not for anyone. They must remain closed." The boy would pout, his lips trembling as if to cry. Sometimes he let tears fall. Sometimes he wailed until the house shook with his cries. The daughter would rush to comfort him, holding him close, whispering gentle words. And when the old man, weary of the noise, turned away, the boy's eyes would gleam with hidden triumph. For he was not merely a child, he was Raven, patient, clever, waiting for the moment to strike. One morning, the boy began his game. He woke early, crawled to his grandfather's side and tugged at his sleeve. "Grandfather," he said softly, "what is in those boxes?" The old man frowned. "Nothing for you." "But please," the boy insisted, his voice gentle, coaxing. "Just a little. Just let me see. I promise I will not touch. I only want to know." The old man shook his head, but the boy returned each morning, his voice a steady song of questions. He cried sometimes, whined often, laughed other times. He pulled at the old man's robe, clung to his knees, looked at him with wide, innocent eyes. Slowly, the old man's heart, though made hard by age and secrecy, began to soften. At last, after many days, the old man sighed. He rose slowly, his back bending like an old branch in the wind. He shuffled to the corner, his hands resting on the largest box. His fingers trembled as he untied the binding, as each knot carried the weight of centuries. He lifted the lid only a little, and from within a shimmer escaped, a faint, delicate sparkle, scattering like dust across the air. Stars. They rushed upward, slipping through the smoke hole of the roof, scattering across the black sky outside. One by one, then by hundreds, they spread across the heavens, tiny points of light pricking the endless void. The boy clapped his hands, laughing with joy. The old man sighed, tired, but a faint smile touched his lips. He looked out through the doorway and saw the world change. The people lifted their faces, eyes wide in wonder. The animals looked upward, ears twitching at the new brilliance. The rivers glimmered faintly, reflecting sparks upon their surfaces. For the first time, the night had companions. But the boy was not finished. Days passed, and again he crawled to his grandfather's side. "Grandfather," he whispered, tugging gently at his sleeve. "Those other boxes, what are they? Please let me see." The old man shook his head, stern again. "No, the stars were enough. The world is brighter now. Be content." But the boy whined, his lips trembling. He wept loudly, louder than before, until his cries echoed beyond the house into the forest. He refused food, turned his face from his mother, wailed until his small body shook with sobs. The old man, weary, rubbed his temples, his patience fraying. At last, he relented. He shuffled again to the corner. His hands shook as he untied the binding of the next box. Slowly, carefully, he lifted the lid. From within, a pale glow slipped out. It rose, soft and silver, curling upward like a breath. It passed through the smoke hole of the roof, scattering across the sky. And there, for the first time, the moon rose above the world. Its light was gentle, not harsh, silver rather than gold. It touched the rivers, turning them into ribbons of glass. It brushed the forests, painting the leaves with quiet sheen. It shone upon the faces of the people, softening their features, giving shape to their smiles. The animals lifted their heads in wonder, their eyes catching the glow. The wolves sang for the first time, their voices rising to the new light. The boy laughed again, clapping, his eyes bright with mischief and delight. The old man sighed, more deeply this time. "Enough," he said. "The stars and the moon are free. The world has light. Be content." But Raven, disguised as the boy, was never content. His hunger burned brighter now. He had seen what was possible. He had seen the stars scatter, the moon rise, and he knew there was more. One box remained, the smallest, the most precious. Inside that box was the sun. And no matter what the old man said, no matter how tightly the lid was bound, no matter how fiercely it was guarded, Raven would have it. For the world was not yet finished. It was brighter, yes, but still incomplete. The sun waited, hidden in wood and fiber, waiting for the moment that trickery and courage would set it free. And Raven, clever Raven, would be the one to bring it forth.
The boy grew quieter after the moon rose, but it was the quiet of calculation, not of contentment. He watched the world change beneath the new silver light, the way river stones gleamed like smooth bones, the way the fur of wolves shone along their backs as they lifted their faces to sing, the way moth wings flashed pale for an instant and were gone. He watched the people as they learned the new sky, how they moved more surely between the trees, how their fires seemed less alone, how children tilted their heads and reached small hands toward the gentle disk that sailed above them. The night was no longer absolute. It had a pulse, a cool and steady rhythm. And still, within the house, one box remained. It was the smallest of the boxes, but it seemed, to the boy's eyes, the heaviest. It did not hum like the first, nor whisper like the second. It held itself perfectly still, as if the silence were a wall it could lean against. The old man kept it closest to his side, sometimes resting a hand upon it as he sat and thought, sometimes tucking it beneath a folded blanket as if it were a newborn he would not let the air touch. When he slept, he pulled it near. When he woke, he checked it first. And in the boy's chest, a patient hunger gathered its wings. He did not beg at once. He did not whine or wail as he had before. He learned his grandfather's footsteps, the creaks of the wooden floor, the long breaths before the old man rose, the quiet moments when the daughter opened the door to let the cool forest air slip in. He learned the seams of the house, the knots in the timbers, the tiny scratch along the edge of the smallest lid. He learned the old man's heart, too, the path it took to relax, the way it softened around simple joys. So the boy wove a new kind of plan. In the mornings, he brought the old man water without being asked, his small hands steady with the clay cup. At midday, he sat at the threshold, humming to himself, stacking pebbles and careful towers that he knocked over only with a laugh. In the evenings, he curled against the old man's side and grew very still, content to feel the warmth of a body that had seen so many winters. He asked no questions, he reached for nothing. And slowly, the old man's watchfulness settled into a gentler vigilance. One afternoon, when the moon slept and the stars hid themselves, the house filled with the graceful clutter of ordinary tasks. The daughter was mending the rim of a basket with thin spruce roots. The old man sorted firewood, setting aside pieces that would burn slow and clean. The boy lay on his belly with his chin upon his hands, tracing the lines in the floorboards with one finger. In a corner, wrapped in a scrap of cloth, sat the smallest box. No one seemed to be looking at it, yet each of them knew precisely where it was, the way one always knows where a wound lies beneath clothing. "Grandfather," the boy said at last, his voice mild like the first ripple on a still pond. The old man did not look up.
will you tell me a story?" The old man's hands paused upon the wood. He was a keeper of many things, of boxes, of silence, of stubbornness, but also of stories. "What story would you hear?" "One about before the stars, before the moon, before the boxes." The old man's eyes moved to the doorway where the forest leaned in as if to listen. "Before," he murmured, "before was only dark. Before was the world breathing without seeing itself." He told of the first fires the people coaxed from damp bark and patience, of the nights the wolves pressed close to the village edge not from hunger but from curiosity, of the way the ocean sounded when no light touched it, a breath without a mouth. He did not speak of the smallest box. The boy listened with his whole face. He smiled where the story made room for it, frowned where it asked him to. When it ended, he sighed softly and said, "I'm glad it isn't only dark anymore." "So am I," and the truth of it warmed the room. Days passed, then a string of days beyond them, like shells threaded on a cord. The boy did not push. He watched the old man sweep, watched him patch a crack in the water bowl with pine pitch, watched him sit and close his eyes as if to listen to something far beneath the floor. Only when the air itself seemed to loosen did the boy take the next careful step. "Grandfather," he asked one evening, almost as if the question had wandered into his mouth of its own accord, "is there a box that is too bright to open?" The old man's shoulders tightened, then relaxed. "There is a box that must not be opened. Brightness is not the same as goodness." The boy nodded as if learning a lesson about the shape of the world. "I understand." He did not cry that night. He did not whine or wail as he had before. He lay quietly and slept. The old man, who had spent so many years guarding what others could not even name, felt something inside him ease, an old rope slackening. He slept more deeply than he had in a long time. In dreams, the house carried its own weather, a slow draft that smelled of cedar and ash, the faint warmth of banked embers. The mice behind the wall made their small arrangements. A single moth tapped once against the doorframe and was still. It was a good night to be unworried, and the old man, grown used to the weight of worry, did not notice its absence until morning. The next day passed like a gentle river. The daughter sang under her breath as she wove. The boy stacked his pebbles and unstacked them. The old man stared at the smallest box and did not touch it, determined not to think about it and thinking of nothing else. Near dusk, the boy sat up suddenly as if called. He tilted his head, listening to a sound no one else could hear. Then he stood and went to the door. Outside, the forest was a black and breathing wall. He stepped to the threshold, small and straight, and lifted his hands as if receiving rain. "What is it?" the daughter asked, setting her work aside. "I think that I am learning what brightness means." He turned back into the house, and for the first time in many days, he walked directly to the smallest box. He did not touch it. He knelt and looked at it the way one looks at a newborn's face, and waited. The old man's voice came low and steady. "No." He nodded. "I know." "Then leave it there," said the old man. "I will," said the boy. He rose and went to the fire, holding his hands near the coals. "Grandfather, your eyes must be tired from guarding so long." The old man closed his eyes as if testing them. They did feel tired. They had been tired for a great many years. "Rest," said the boy. "I will sit by you." The old man did not intend to sleep. He intended to rest his back against the wall and keep watch the way a tree keeps watch over its own roots. But the day had been long with thinking, and the night was sweet with the kind of quiet that takes a man into its arms. His chin lowered, his hands opened and closed. The daughter placed a blanket over his knees. The boy's gaze drifted back to the box and away again, like a tide that knows the shape of its shore. When the old man slept, he slept all the way. The daughter rose to set another log upon the embers. The boy joined her, and together they moved with the unspoken choruses of a household at ease. The wood caught. A slow, fine glow deepened in the hearth. The daughter smiled at the boy, love warm upon her face, and for a heartbeat, Raven forgot any name but the one she used for him. He went to the corner then, not quickly, not with the flurry of a thief, but with the reverence of someone approaching a sacred bundle. He knelt, his small fingers, clever and patient, found the fiber cord where it tucked under itself. He did not pull, he teased. He did not force, he persuaded. A knot loosened. Another followed, as if it had only been waiting for someone to speak to it kindly. The binding lay in his lap like a shed snakeskin. He placed both hands on the lid. It was warm, not from the fire, but from its own contained heat, a kind of sleeping sun that remembered itself. He lifted just enough, and a line of light, so thin that it could have been a hair, slipped into the room. It was not like the stars, which had shaken themselves free like a handful of sparks. It was not like the moon, which had exhaled into the sky like a sigh becoming visible. This was a presence. It waited, with a patience older than the old man, older than the forest's first breath. The boy widened the opening. The light widened with it, a pale gold at first, then a deeper gold, then something that could not be compared to anything the world had known. It touched the boy's face, and for the first time he saw the color of his own hands. The daughter gasped softly, a sound like a deer discovering a clearing. She took one step forward and stopped, her body remembering the old man's warnings while her heart lifted toward what it had never seen. The boy looked at her, and in his eyes lay a promise, not for himself, but for the world. Rivers that would glitter, mountains that would reveal their bones, children whose laughter would shine as well as ring. Behind them, the old man stirred. The dream loosened its arms and let him fall backward into a waking. He opened his eyes upon a house that held the dawn in a box. "No," he said, but the word had no weight left in it. He reached a hand forward and then let it fall into his lap. He had guarded so long that he had forgotten what he was guarding for. The boy lifted the lid.
Light walked into the room. It did not rush, it arrived. It placed itself upon wood and cloth and skin, naming each with a color. The daughter's hair shone with a brown he had never seen and now could never forget. The old man's face held 100 stories he had carried alone. The boy's hands were the hands of a maker, a breaker, a bringer. And the light, even then, was only a fistful of what the box held. Perhaps the old man might have shut the lid again in that moment, if there had been time to remember his devotion to secrecy. Perhaps the daughter might have spoken a plea, or the boy might have paused of his own will and closed what he had opened in mercy. But the world itself leaned forward. The house itself took a breath. The little golden thing within the box turned its face to the door and waited to be taken outside. The boy did not think. He simply became who he was. His small body lightened. His bones remembered flight. The edges of him loosened into feathers, the way ice loosens into water. Where a child had been kneeling, a black bird now stood, shining with a brightness that belonged to another color entirely and yet wore black as if it were the truest shade of light. Raven seized the sun. It was not, in his beak, a sprawling blaze too large for the world to bear. It was a compact, perfect thing. A golden coil held in a shell of brilliance, the size of a great apple or a small melon, heavy with promise. He leapt for the door. The daughter cried out, "Wait!" not in fear, but in astonishment, lifting her hands as if she might catch a blessing falling from a height. The old man rose as much as his years would allow, one hand extended not to forbid, but to touch, to feel the warmth that had visited his house at last.
Raven beat his wings. The air rose to meet him. He flew through the doorway into the forest, and the light went with him. At once, the world changed its posture. Trees that had known only the press of darkness lifted their crowns as if to taste. The moss upon fallen logs showed 1,000 greens no one had named. Rivers unspooled themselves into mirrors. The faces of the people raised toward the sudden shine broke into expressions so new they had no words yet for them. The wolves blinked against the radiance and then stood astonished as their shadows lengthened like companions stepping forward. Birds that had stayed silent felt their throats open. Song wanted to be seen as well as heard. But Raven did not fly high. He flew close to the ground, weaving between trunks, skimming over ferns, shouldering past hanging lichen. He held the sun gently but firmly, its heat licking at his beak, its brightness spilling from between his feathers like water through reeds. Everywhere he passed, day woke in footprints.
Behind him, the old man stepped into the doorway and put his hand to the lintel. He watched the blackbird carry away what he had guarded for so long, and the old rope of fear snapped with a quiet sound. He did not shout. He did not curse. He only stood and felt the warmth on his face, and knew that his long labor had never meant to keep the world from this, only to keep it until someone could bring it. The daughter ran to the threshold, and then into the first shafts of light. She laughed, a sound like cups ringing, and the light used her laughter the way a river uses gravity, running along it, making it gleam. Raven climbed. He rose above the treetops, and the sun in his beak burned brighter, hungry for distance. Wind spoke in his feathers. The sky, which had been only a black veil, dotted with star seeds and silvered by a shy moon, unfolded itself to receive a golden seed that would not hide. Up, said the heat. Up, said the world. Up, said the thing inside Raven that was more than trick and more than bird. He went up. As he rose, something else happened. The light, so close to his feathers, so intimate to his flight, kissed him with a hotter tongue. Soot, says one telling. Smoke, says another, but not from the house. There had been no soot there. Rather, from the newborn sun itself, a brightness that had not learned to give without marking. The black upon Raven deepened, became not merely the color of his feathers, but their memory of first fire. He did not drop the sun. He tightened his grip and went higher. When he reached a height where trees became mossed stones and rivers became threads of moving glass, the sun wriggled like a living thing and asked to be let loose. Raven opened his beak. The sun sprang upward like a deer freed from a snare. It bounded into the sky and found a path it would learn to walk again and again. It went from low to high, from east to west, though no one then called those directions by name. It learned to lean, to angle its warmth so that the world would not burn, but grow. It learned the length of shadows and the weight of noon. Its first arc was clumsy, beautiful, overwhelming. Where it passed, dew steamed off leaves like spirits rising. Snow began to take the idea of water into itself. The ocean rolled and for the first time sparkled, each crest a shout of light. Below, people threw up their hands to shade their eyes and then lowered them to search each other's faces, laughing to find cheekbones and eyebrows, the color of hair, and the exact blue of a child's irises. They touched their own arms to see the sheen of skin, the constellations of freckles, and the long, healed scars telling old stories. They looked at the mountains they had only felt with feet and breath, and the mountains finally showed themselves, ribs and shoulders, wrinkles of stone, teeth of ice. Raven circled.
His shadow, for the first time, had a crisp edge that ran along the canopy like a brushstroke. He felt tired and exalted at once, the way a messenger feels when the letter is not only delivered, but opened and read with tears. He landed upon a high cedar whose topmost branch swayed under his weight. The sun rode on, more sure with each heartbeat, and the morning of the first day laid itself across the land like a blanket pulled up under its chin. In the house, the old man sat down upon the threshold, his feet in light and his back in shade. He put his head in his hands and laughed once, not bitter, not rueful, freed. He had kept the small box closed until the right hands found it. He had not failed, he had finished. The daughter, standing in the meadow, lifted her face to the warmth and closed her eyes. She felt the color it poured into her. She felt the way the air loosened, the way the bodies of trees were not only silhouettes, but bark and sap and insect trails. She thought of the child who had been a bird, and the bird who had been a child, and love rose in her like a tide. It did not matter that he had flown. Everything he had aimed to heal was healing.
Raven watched the sun settle into its path. He saw how the moon would follow, shy in daylight, bold when the sun would finally rest. He saw how the stars would become the quilt of night, no longer the only company, but faithful companions still. He saw how people would learn to plant when the ground warmed, to follow the angle of light to understand the turn of seasons, to rest when it fled and rise when it returned. He saw wolves hunting by sight as well as scent, salmon flashing silver as they leapt in currents that now carried glory, eagles writing their names in blue. He also saw what brightness would show that darkness had hidden, the edges of cliffs, the teeth of traps, the eyes of those who lied. Light is not only gentleness, it is also a mirror. He folded his wings against his body and accepted this as the price of seeing. By the time the sun finished its first long crossing and leaned toward an unknown western rest, the world had already changed its stories. Children sat at the edge of water and named what they saw. Elders stood in doorways and warmed their knuckles. Women traced the new shadows their baskets made upon the floor. Men lifted their faces and let the light reveal their years. Their pride softened into gratitude. And far above them all, Raven, still black as the first night, closed his eyes and let the newborn afternoon wind comb his feathers. He had been a trickster, he had been a baby, he had been a thief, he had been a deliverer. He would be all these things again in one telling or another. The world would argue later about which name fit best. For now, it did not matter. For now, the sun moved, and with it time as a warm animal walked through the rooms of the world. When evening finally came, the evening lit by a sunset instead of extinguished by a curtain, colors gathered where the sky bent to the sea. Saffron, rose, amber, a violet so tender it almost sank back into darkness. The people watched without speaking. The light did not simply leave, it promised to return. The moon, seeing her new place, rose with poise and began the work of gentling the hours. The stars, neither jealous nor afraid, blinked themselves awake as if whispering, "We are here too, and we are not less." Raven lifted from the cedar and glided down through air that had learned to glitter. He passed over the old man's house. At the door, the old man raised a hand, a gesture that could have been farewell or blessing or both. The daughter looked up and smiled, and in that smile Raven understood that some doors remain open even when the child who walked through them has become something else entirely. He flew toward the coast, where the ocean had become a living sheet of light. Waves knelt at the shore and broke into lace. The gulls found themselves astonished by their own shadows. The rocks, wet and dark, were crowns of brightness where the foam slid away. Raven beat his wings once, twice, and rose on a draught that smelt of salt and spruce. He did not carry the sun anymore. The sun carried itself. But something of its path lay now within him, a line along which he might fly when he needed to remember who he was.
On a high outcropping, he landed, and there he stood for a long time, watching the world learn its new face. He did not preen, he did not speak. He kept his beak closed and felt the last heat upon it like a secret. His feathers, marked and deepened by the proximity of light, gleamed as black as a raven can be, which is to say, like a night that has learned to hold stars. Down in the villages, people began their first daylight work. Nets were spread where they could be seen. Tools were sharpened and admired for their clear edges. Paths were swept and widened. Someone painted a line upon a wall because color had become a story worth telling. Someone else carved a small circle into the handle of a spoon. The first sun drawn by a human hand, perhaps, or perhaps the 50th, but the first to be seen in daylight. The old man, when night finally came, returned to his empty corner and laid the smallest box upon his lap. He ran a finger along its rim. It was only wood now, beautiful wood, polished by years of touch and meaning, but plain again. He smiled and set it gently on a shelf beside the others. Then he went to the doorway and stood beneath the moon. He breathed the cool light into his lungs and let it out slowly like forgiveness. Raven, upon his rock, watched the stars gather and the new day's memories soften into blue. He listened to the wolves sing in a way that was both new and ancient. He listened to the ocean telling its endless story in a voice that could now be read as well as heard. He watched a child hold a hand up to catch moonlight and laughed softly to himself, a sound like a ridge of wind moving through spruce tops. He had done what he had come to do. But stories are not rivers that flow only one way. They eddy, they swirl back, they find new channels. Already, if you listened closely, you could hear the next chapter gathering. What light reveals, what it asks, the bargains tricksters make with truth, the ways a world, newly bright, must learn not only to wake, but to rest. For now, though, the first day had been carried across the sky and set carefully on the world's bedside. The moon drew the covers up, the stars fluffed the pillows, and somewhere, in a house where the corners were no longer unfathomable but pleasantly dim, an old man closed his eyes without fear, a daughter slept with a smile on her mouth, and far above the cedar tops, Raven folded his black wings and dreamed not of boxes, but of horizons. The sun would come again.
Morning came again, and this time the world knew how to greet it. The people woke, not because the fire had dwindled or because a whisper moved through the village, but because a thin band of gold drew itself along the far edge of the sky like a promise being underlined. Children were the first to notice. They sat up and pointed with small hands, their faces opening the way flowers open, suddenly, completely. Mothers smiled without quite meaning to. Fathers rubbed their eyes and watched the light slide down the slopes, step by patient step, until it laid a warm palm upon the roofs and the door lintels, and finally upon the ground at their feet. Color arrived like memory returning. The grass was not only soft, it was green. The river was not only cool, it was blue when the sky looked back from it, and silver when the sun came to rest upon its surface. The bark of cedar wore 1,000 browns that had been there all along and were now allowed to speak. People touched what they could touch, cloth, wood, one another's cheeks, astonished that their hands could confirm what their eyes were learning. The day moved with a rhythm no one yet knew by name.
The sun climbed. Shadows, which had been loosened by the moon into gentle pools, now stretched and sharpened, first long, then shorter, then gathering underfoot at noon like secrets taking cover. The air warmed. Resin in the trees exhaled a faint sweetness. In the distance, a hawk wrote careful circles upon the high blue page. Those circles meant something. They would learn in time what. Work, which had once been a matter of patience and touch and listening, became something else under the sun. Still patient, still careful, but more exact. Nets were mended with finer stitches because the eye could see the gap before a fish found it. Spears were polished and their points judged by the line of light along their edges. Women spread baskets upon flat stones and wove patterns that had waited in their minds without knowing where to go. One woman lifted a handful of ochre from a riverbank and found that it stained her fingers with a quiet fire. She made a paste with water and ash and drew a sun upon the smooth side of a plank, a round, simple thing with lines that reached outward. A child pressed his hand beside it, leaving the shape of his palm in pale brown. No one spoke. It felt like naming, and naming felt like gratitude. At the edge of the village, an elder stood with his back straight and watched shadows. He placed a stick upright in the ground and returned to it again and again during the day, marking where the shadow fell each time. He did not say why he did this. He did not need to say. By evening, a fan of small stones lay upon the dirt, each stone a memory of where the sun had been. The elder smoothed his hair and smiled a little. The world had given them a clock, and it could be read from the earth. Raven watched all of this from high places and low, from the top of a cedar that had survived 10 winters of storms, and from a flat rock warmed by the midday light. His feathers held the new brightness as if the sun had written its first letter there and left the ink to dry. He felt a looseness in himself that was both satisfaction and wonder, like a song that had been sung well and now continued singing inside the chest without help. He flew to the ocean and found it changed. Waves used to rise and fall with a darkness that muffled their voices. Now they laughed. Each crest broke into 1,000 shards of light, leaping and vanishing. Seals lifted their heads and blinked. Their whiskers shone with delicate points where droplets held the sun for a heartbeat. Salmon far offshore turned like coins being considered, and a school moved as one thought. On a kelp bed, a heron stood as if carved from dusk, and when it struck at a fish, its beak threw a needle of light that stitched water to sky. In the forest, the changes went deeper than brightness. Ferns unfurled with a swiftness that felt like decision. Flowers that had never risked opening in the long night hesitated and then showed what they had been hoarding. A yellow like the inside of warmth, a purple like quiet, a white so clean it made people hold their breath. Bees discovered their work as if waking up inside a job they already knew how to do. Their bodies wore small saddlebags of gold, and their legs scribbled short lines upon the air.
The first rain under sunlight came, and it was a new kind of sound. Drops fell through sheen instead of through shadow. Puddles held the shape of clouds and let it go. Children reached into those small mirrors and came up laughing at the way water made their fingers into something doubled and strange. When the sun returned from behind the thin gray veil, the rain did not end all at once. It softened into mist, and that mist, meeting light, formed a bridge of color across the river, faint at first, then clearer,
an arc that seemed to bless both banks. No one had asked for such a thing. The world gave it anyway. At night still came. The moon rose with a confidence she had not known before. She learned to live not as a queen of emptiness, but as a keeper of rest. The stars, too, took their places without jealousy. They sharpened when the air cooled and blurred kindly when smoke from the fires wandered upward to greet them. Some children, tired from the new day, slept before moonrise. Others lay on their backs in the grass and made stories from the patterns overhead. After a while, those stories settled into shapes people could point to and agree upon. A fisher showed a child where the salmon swam among the lights. A mother traced the handle of a dipper and said, "This will pour our nights into morning." The old man woke early each day, out of habit, long before the sun had climbed, and sat on the threshold. He did not guard any box now. He guarded nothing at all. He warmed his knees and his hands. He watched people come and go. They greeted him with a softness they had not used before, as if the light had paved a road between the house and their voices. Sometimes he wept without reason. Sometimes he laughed at the same emptiness. The daughter moved about the dwelling with an ease that made the house larger. She tied back her hair and worked while the light poured through the door, and every once in a while she stopped and held her palms in it, as if receiving a blessing still fresh each time. Not everything the sun revealed was a comfort. Paths showed their stones as well as their smooth places. A child fell and learned the color of blood. A hunter misjudged distance because distance could now be seen, and his spear struck a stump and splintered. Men and women noticed lines at the corners of eyes that had not bothered them when the world was kind enough to blur. Two neighbors who had lived side by side without envy saw that one house sat a little straighter, that one garden caught more morning, and a tightness passed between them like a cloud. Light does not choose, it tells. The telling is a kind of mercy, even when it stings. Raven understood this. He did not hide from it. He watched a fox try to move through shadow and learned that hunted creatures must now become scholars of sun and shade. He watched a cedar sapling burn where a careless ember fell and saw men run with water they could finally see clearly in their bowls. The sapling died, but in its place, next spring, a clear ring of shoots rose from the stump like a small chorus. The world had always been a trade. Now the trades had names. As days passed, the people began to make a ceremony without deciding to. On the morning when the sun reached the halfway point between the tall stones the elder had placed, the village gathered in the clearing. They brought with them what the light had made more possible. Baskets dyed with earth and berry, fish dried to silver ribbons, a blanket woven tight as moss. They set these upon a mat and waited. No one led. There was nothing to ask for. They only let the morning rise through them, and together they breathed. An old woman, older than the old man, began a song, not quite a melody, more like the sound of a hand smoothing cloth. Others joined. The song said, "We see." It said, "We are seen." It said nothing else because there was nothing else to say. When it ended, people touched one another's shoulders. A child ran to the edge of the clearing and held his arms out to measure his shadow, laughing when it grew shorter by the heartbeat. The elder moved a new stone to a new mark and felt his chest fill with a kind of quiet he had not owned since youth. Raven came then, not to be thanked. He did not think of himself as a thing to be thanked, but because the air above the ceremony was interesting. He circled once, twice, and when the sun threw his shadow upon the clearing, people looked up and smiled. He landed upon the high arm of a dead tree and tilted his head. A child waved. The old woman put the back of her hand to her mouth and said something only the air needed to hear. Raven clicked his beak as if to say, "I hear you anyway." He did not stay long. Tricksters do not sit in the center of gratitude comfortably. He rose and went toward the river, where he watched a group of boys throwing stones, not at fish, but at the sun sliding on the water. Their aim was terrible and perfect. The splashes cut small holes in the reflection, and it mended itself at once. A kingfisher just returned to this stretch of bank because brightness made its work into pleasure, rattled a call from a branch, and then broke the surface with a beak that had become a silver needle in the light. Toward evening, a wind came off the sea, cool and carrying salt. The people learned what shadows do when the sun leans low. They lengthen again, not like threats, but like companions stretching their legs for a walk. The day did not stop, it leaned. Faces took on the kind of beauty one does not speak of in case the speaking frightens it away. Men sorted the day's catch by color as well as by size. Women shook out blankets and watched dust perform a dance in slanted gold. Children, tired at last from all the seeing, let sleep take them without argument as soon as the sun's rim touched the far line of the world. That night, in the house where guarding had become resting, the old man dreamed he was walking through a forest that had learned to hum. In his dream, he found the smallest box, not wooden, not bound, not closed. It was the sun as a young thing again, curled like a fern. He put his hand over it and felt not heat, but a steady heartbeat. He woke without sadness. He put a log on the embers and sat in the doorway with his feet cool on the earth until the moon leaned out from behind a tree and saw him there and seemed pleased. In the days that followed, the people began to speak of time as if it could be carried. They said, "We will meet when your shadow is as long as you are." They said, "We will go when the sun reaches the notch in that ridge." They said, "We will return when the river wears a sheet of gold." They were not wrong. They were making a rope of hours and pulling themselves along it together. Children invented new games that required light. They chased the edges of each other's shadows and tried to step upon them. They held flat pieces of cedar and tilted them until squares of brightness climbed a wall and then slid down. And they pretended to be fishermen of light. One girl discovered that if she held her hands a certain way, she could make a bird on the house wall, and the bird could open and close its beak. She made a whole flock. When Raven saw this, he laughed a small laugh that shook his chest and thought, "I am not the only maker of birds." A man who had once carved by feel began to carve by sight without losing the tenderness of his hands. He made a mask with one eye open and one closed and said, "This is to remember." He did not say what to remember. The mask knew, and those who looked at it knew, and that was enough. A woman dried salmon and discovered that under the sun a salmon's skin tells a map, the story of where it has been. She could not read the map, but she loved that it existed. Once, in the late afternoon, a cloud crossed the sun and the world dimmed. A child cried out. His mother put a hand on his head and said, "Watch." The cloud moved on. The light returned. The child let out his breath as if he had been saving the world with it. Later, when an eagle's shadow passed over the same boy, he did not flinch. He looked up to see the wide wings, and the eagle's eye glanced down and away as if acknowledging a fellow who had learned to look.
Raven visited the daughter sometimes, though he never landed on the roof. He kept to a nearby branch and listened to the way her work sounded in the sun. She sang less now that the world sang more, or perhaps the world's singing made hers softer, and he had to come nearer to hear it. Once, she stepped to the door and turned her face toward him, though he had not moved or clicked or called. "You are well?" she said, although he had not asked to be asked. He bowed his head. "Then I am well too," she said, and returned to her task. He stayed a while, content without being sure why, then flew to where the tide combed the rocks with slow patience. Evening after evening, the sky made a pageant of leaving. People did not grow used to it. They watched each time as if the colors might not come again, as if gratitude should be rehearsed daily to remain strong. When darkness finally gathered, it was thinner than before, a cloth through which one could see. The moon led them to their beds, and the stars sat by their doors. Sleep itself changed. It came sooner, deeper, a restfulness made of confidence. In dreams, people walked the same paths they walked by day, and those paths were not frightening. They woke eager to go again where they had already gone. On the 7th morning after the sun learned its route, the elder stood at his stick again and found that the shadow fell where it had fallen on the first day, nearly stone for stone. He nodded. A cycle had been tied. He would teach it to a child, and the child would move the stones when his hands were ready. He looked up at the high cedar and saw Raven there, black upon green, and lifted one hand. The gesture was both greeting and agreement. The world had shifted and settled. They would live inside its new balance. Raven spread his wings and let himself fall from the branch, then caught the air as if catching a salmon from a dark pool, and turned toward the coast. He did not think of destiny or design. He thought of the way wind behaves over water and of the warm line it holds where the sun has been. He thought of the next thing a trickster might need to do, and of the next thing a teacher might need to be. He did not decide between them. He had learned that he did not have to. Behind him, the village moved into the day as into a familiar river. Before him, the ocean learned to glitter in ways it would never tire of. Above him, the sun walked the sky, neither hurried nor late. And everywhere, in the thin seam where light meets whatever it touches, the world wrote its first long letter to itself and read it aloud. The sun had not only given light, it had given rhythm. Days no longer bled endlessly into nights, they stacked, one upon another, each with a character of its own. And from that stacking, something new was born. Time that could be measured not only by shadows, but by change. At first, the people thought the sun would be the same each day. But the world has many faces, and the sun was only the first mirror to reveal them. Soon, the people noticed that mornings did not always come with the same sharpness. Some dawns were thin and cool, the air carrying a hint of dampness that clung to their hair. Others came warm, already heavy with the promise of heat. The elders sat outside their dwellings and said, "The sun is teaching us its moods." The forest felt these moods too. When warmth lingered, buds appeared on branches, tentative at first, then bold, turning into leaves that whispered together in bright conversations. When coolness stretched longer, the leaves yellowed, then browned, then fell to the earth in soft carpets that rustled underfoot. The people discovered they could predict these turns, and in predicting, they could prepare. They began to store food not just for night, but for the long sleep of the earth they would later call winter. Raven, who had known only endless dark, watched with sharp delight as the seasons unrolled. He flew high and saw entire valleys blaze with color, then strip themselves bare, then dress again in green. It was like watching a storyteller who never stopped, each chapter different, each lesson layered upon the last.
He cawed in wonder, a sound that scattered crows and made children point upward, saying, "He is laughing again." The animals, too, learned new ways. Bears grew heavy in the bright months, eating until their bellies swelled, then vanished into caves when the air sharpened. Deer grew coats thicker than the woven blankets of the people, then shed them when warmth returned. Birds vanished one season and returned the next, following paths written in the air. The people called them travelers, and children asked where they went. The answer was always the same. They follow the sun. They will come back when it calls them. The rivers taught lessons of change as well. In warmth, they swelled with melt from far mountains, rushing fast, carrying salmon in silver waves. In cold, they stilled, their edges crusted with ice, their voices hushed but not silenced. Children broke the ice with sticks and laughed at the crack that echoed. Elders said, "Respect the river even when it sleeps. It never forgets its strength." The sea shifted colors with the sun's journeys. Some mornings it was blue, so deep it swallowed thought. Other days it was gray, restless, tipped with white foam that hissed as it broke. Fishermen learned to read those colors as signs, to know when to cast their nets and when to wait. One said, "The sea is like a mother. Sometimes she feeds you, sometimes she warns you, always she must be listened to." And so people began to shape their lives around these cycles. They planted when warmth lingered, harvested when days grew short, stored what they could, and trusted that the sun would return after its weakest days. They carved markers in wood and stone to track the turning. A boy drew circles upon bark, one for each sunrise, and noticed the pattern of growth and decline. Without knowing the word, he had made a calendar.
Ceremonies grew with the seasons. When leaves burst green, people gathered and sang to welcome new life. They wore wreaths of fresh branches and danced in circles, their steps light, their laughter spilling like water. When leaves fell, they gathered again, more solemn, thanking the trees, thanking the animals hunted, thanking the earth for its giving. They placed food in the fire, letting the smoke carry their gratitude to the sky. Raven attended these ceremonies often. He perched on poles or branches nearby, cocking his head at the drums and the songs. He enjoyed the sound, though he never joined in. His gift had been light, and from light came music. But he remained the trickster, part proud, part distant, always watching. Sometimes he dropped a feather at the edge of a dance, black and shining. The people took it as a blessing. One evening, as autumn painted the hills in red and gold, a child approached the old man and asked, "Grandfather, will the sun ever leave us?" The old man, once the guardian of the boxes, looked into the fire before answering. His eyes reflected the flames as he said, "The sun is free now. It does not belong to me, nor to anyone. It walks its path because the world asked it to. It may hide, it may rest, but it will not abandon us." The child nodded, comforted, though Raven, listening from the roof, knew more. He knew that the sun could be hidden by clouds, swallowed by storms, or dimmed by smoke. He knew the world was fragile, even under light. Yet he let the child's belief stand. After all, belief itself was another kind of light. Seasons turned, and people changed with them. They learned patience from winter, hope from spring, labor from summer, gratitude from autumn. They became more than survivors of dark. They became students of the sun's lessons. Their stories grew longer, their songs richer, their carvings deeper. And always, at the edge of their gatherings, Raven lingered, watching the world he had remade.
The sun taught the people many things, but it taught the animals first.
They had always moved by scent and sound, by the invisible maps of wind and water. Now those maps grew visible, inked in shadow and shine, in lines upon the ground that changed with each hour. The new day did not make them different so much as more themselves. What had been hidden became manner, and what had been manner became story. At the river mouth, wolves learned again how to be wolves. They had padded the long night with patience and caution, their ears their lanterns, their noses their fires. In the light they discovered the grammar of distance. A wolf standing upon a gravel bar could now see the ripple where salmon gathered, and could judge, with an accuracy that felt like music, the exact moment to step forward and take what the river offered. Their coats, once only texture, were now color: smoke gray, coal, ash, winter brown. And each wolf knew the others by sight in a way that made their bodies sing with recognition. When they ran at dawn, the sun stitched them to the ground with long, leaping shadows that kept pace like loyal cousins. When they stopped and looked back over their shoulders, the light filled their eyes, not with gentleness or ferocity, but with clarity. They were seen. They could see. Bears learned the clock of bees. In the old dark, a hive was a rumor passed among roots. Under the sun, the air above flowers was a script any bear could read. Gold drifted from blossom to blossom on furred legs, and the sound, no longer a smear of humming but many threads braided, told the bear not only where sweetness lived, but when it would be richest. In the high heat of afternoon, the bear learned calm, drowsing in shade where slashes of light laid tiger stripes upon its flanks. In the low light of evening, it learned industry, turning stones in creek-bed classrooms where caddis and crayfish lived, nosing under logs that the sun had warmed all day until the bark released a spice of sap. When berries blued and reddened with ripeness, the bear stood on hind legs, a scholar of thorns, and harvested as delicately as a midwife. Those who watched from a distance marveled at how a creature so large could be so careful. Salmon refined the word silver. They had borne that color always, but silver had been a feeling more than a fact. Now it was truth written upon body after body. In sun-shattered riffles, they became a million small mirrors that moved with intention. Ravens watched from driftwood. Eagles wrote their hunger into the sky with slow wing beats, ready to turn a shadow into a dive. Children on the bank shaded their eyes with hands and learned two ideas at once: the abundance of life and the precision of taking. Elders said, "We honor the first fish," and the first fish was lifted with words that had waited all the long night to be spoken. The river kept some, the people kept some. Wolves and bears took their share, and the silver that returned to the sea carried the sun upon it like a blessing. Eagles, who had slept in a sky without edges, learned geometry. From the high ledges they watched thermals build invisible ladders and began to climb them. In that climbing, they discovered the pleasure of a turn so slow it could be mistaken for stillness. The world below, forests, water, stones, became a quilt they knew by stitch and pattern. When an eagle folded its wings and dropped, it became a sentence written straight through the heart of air. At the instant of taking, when talons entered water and a fish turned from silver to weight, the sun cracked into a spray that reassembled on the surface as if it knew how to mend itself. A boy watching from the bank whispered, "Teacher," without knowing to whom. Deer learned tenderness as tactic. Light showed them what shadow could do. They stood at the border where meadow joined forest and allowed the sun to draw their outlines on grass. Then they stepped backward, one hoof at a time. until the outline dissolved. Fawns, all legs and listening, practiced the art of vanishing by standing perfectly where a dapple of light lay among leaves. Mothers taught with a glance, "Now." The fawns sank as if lowered by a string. Later, in open fields, the herd became a moving lake that rippled without splash, a choreography the sun did not lead, but admired. Foxes learned comedy. It had always been theirs, a red thread woven through hunger and wit, but sunlight made their jokes visible. A fox trotted into a clearing with a peanut-straight back and a tail like a brush painting the path behind it. It paused, cocked its head, and let the sun paint a coin on its eye. Then it leapt straight up, all 4 feet leaving ground at once, and pounced where a vole tunneled beneath snow thin to lace by spring. The trick worked because the fox had learned to use the sun as an accomplice. What lay below cast a moving penumbra above, and the fox could read that shadow as a word. When it missed, it did not sulk. It tossed its head, sneezed sunlight, and trotted on, grinning at a secret only it understood.
Owls refused the lie that the sun had ended their wisdom. They narrowed their eyes and moved deeper into the book of night. But night was changed, gentled, made legible by the promise of day. An owl on a dusk branch was a priest of the new dusk, interpreting the scriptures of mouse rustle and moth flutter. Moonlight, the kind the boy had released second, silvered their faces into coins old kingdoms would have envied. They asked no permission to keep the dark sacred. They kept it by living inside it so well that even the sun had to admit respect. Whales accepted a mirror. For ages they had traveled in a ceilingless house. Now that ceiling shone. When the sun lay upon the ocean like a road, whales rose and wrote their punctuation upon it. Ellipses of blows, a comma of a tail, the long dash of a back rolling under the horizon. Calves discovered their shadows and chased them just under the surface, learning that a body has 2 faces when the world is bright, what it is and what it tells upon water. In certain mornings, the ocean was so crowded with light that a breach looked like a cathedral being built for a heartbeat and then unbuilt softly, as if the builders were careful of the neighbors. Insects became composers. They had been musicians before. No one who has slept near reeds in a windless night would deny that. But the new day added instruments. The drum of beetle against bark, the glass chime of dragonfly wing, the fuzzed whisper of moth upon lichen, these learned to harmonize with the slant of sun. Butterflies unrolled tongues not only to feed, but to draw fine lines of shadow upon petals. Bees rehearsed paths between flowers until those paths became highways that even a child could see if the child squinted right. And when rain arrived in the bright, 100 small worlds, spiderwebs, moss cups, the throats of flowers, held beads that quivered with their own private suns, each bead a thought the day had given back to the maker. Ravens, too, ravenskin, found their roles anew. They were black the way a violin case is black, hiding music rather than refusing it. Under the sun, they became gloss. Oil-slick greens and purples whispered along their feathers when they turned, a kind of private rainbow no one could arrest with the hand. They fell in love with theft again, but daylight made their thefts into theater. A raven happened upon a fisherman's shining spoon and took it not for hunger, but for astonishment. It lifted the spoon into the air, and the spoon learned to throw sunlight in pieces. The raven performed a loop for no audience, then placed the treasure upon a stump, stared at it with one night-bright eye, and hid it in moss. Later, a child found that grave and laughed so loud the raven startled, then laughed too, because laughter is a contagion the sun carried better than disease. People watched and learned a discipline that looked like reverence. They began to take not because the dark made them desperate, but because the light taught them measure.
A hunter timed his throw by shadow. When a deer's neckline crossed the long, thin line of a fir's shade, he knew the angle would be true. A gatherer carried a basket lined with leaves and learned that berries warmed by morning were sweeter than those that slept in shade. A weaver sat where light fell across her lap, and her fingers became more exact, as if sunshine had taught them the alphabet again, and they were writing better words with fibers. Under midday stillness, men mended nets and found that the knots themselves taught patience. Pull too quickly, and the light will show the error immediately. Ease the crossing, and the net will repay you in the night. Not all lessons were gentle. The sun drew a hard line across the back of a careless man, and that line burned. Children learned that bright metal is not only pretty, it can cut. A hawk took a chick from a yard and left a cry as shrill as the shadow had been swift. A summer so hungry for itself that the earth cracked made the people carry water farther than they wished. But as with the wolves and bears, the people became more themselves. They did not learn to avoid cost, they learned to count it, and in counting, to honor what they took.
Raven traveled among these lessons with a satisfaction that looked, to those who did not know him, like arrogance. He tossed sticks into streams just to see how current and sunlight would argue. He shouted at eagles because some stories require rivals. He sat on the old man's roof at noon and let the heat soak his bones as if he had paid for it with more than beak and cleverness. Sometimes he joined his kin in rowdy congress, and their black bodies gathered upon white driftwood looked like notes spilled upon a page waiting for someone to sing. They did not sing, they told jokes, and the wind pretended not to listen. One late spring morning, a boy and a girl followed deer trails until the forest opened into a field of lupin. Each spike wore a tower of blooms, blue and violet and white, and bees stitched from one to the next as if making a quilt the earth would lie under at night. The children lay on their backs and watched clouds move. "That one is a whale," the boy said. "That one is a spoon," the girl answered. And the raven on the cedar laughed because children were doing his work better than he could have planned. After a time, the boy closed one eye and measured a tree with his thumb. He was not making fun of the tree. He was learning the scale of looking. The girl cupped her hand and trapped sunlight, and then let it go through her fingers in small, warm spills. They went home and told no one what they had done, because telling would have torn it into smaller pieces. In autumn, when salmon turned the rivers into moving fire, and the hills went to ember and rust, a new story began to live in the village, a story that light had made room for. A woman whose hands were always steady began to paint with earth. She ground red rock, yellow clay, black charcoal, and white shell into powders and mixed them with oils pressed from fish and seeds. On planks, she made long bodies that were not exactly wolves or salmon or ravens, but were all of them at once. Spirals of breath, ribs of river, eyes that watched from lore. The sun, coming through the doorway, sat in those eyes and sat in them. People stood long without speaking. They did not ask what the pictures were. They were the pictures. At night, beneath the new moon, owls wrote their own counsel upon branches. A child woke from a dream and listened and knew, without being told, that this too was the world's classroom. He went back to sleep because sleep had become a place to learn rather than to hide. In the morning, he asked no questions. He took a stick and drew circles where the elder had placed stones, not to copy, but to continue.
One winter, a great storm walked in from the ocean carrying a cloak of cloud so thick the sun could not press through. Day became a paler dark. People stoked fires and measured wood. Wolves hunted differently. Bears slept. Ravens found laughter thinner and saved it for later. But the knowledge of light did not leave the bodies that had learned it. Skills honed in brightness worked by memory in dim. Children who had once cried at cloud cover and now watched the way snow made the world a book of whiteness, where every track was a sentence. The old man sat at the threshold and felt the absence as presence, a proof that what had come could go and would return. When at last the storm moved on and the sun stepped out as if from behind a curtain, no one cheered. They stood quietly and lifted their faces. Gratitude is loudest when it says nothing. Raven, after the storm, flew low over the beach and found a kelp bulb the size of a child's head, polished by waves until it shone like lacquer. He pecked it and it rang, a hollow drum. He pecked again and laughed and pecked a rhythm until from the trees a drum answered, the hand drum of a woman calling her children in from play. Raven bowed to the invisible duet and left the kelp for them. When the children came, they rolled it to hear its music and named it Sea Drum. The name stuck, though no one had asked permission from the tide. So the creatures lived under the new sun, not as subjects, but as partners. Each day added a line to the treaty between light and life. Wolves signed with tracks. Bears signed with broken logs that fed 1,000 small appetites. Salmon signed with bodies that became forest. Eagles signed with bones that lay clean upon rock and taught children about the shapes living things leave behind. Owls signed with silence so thick it held up the moon. Foxes signed with laughter that needed no audience. Ravens signed with whatever they could carry and whatever they could not carry but wanted to. And across these signatures, people wrote their careful names, not on paper, but in choices. They timed their work to warmth, rested when cold requested it, told stories that braided animals and weather and the turn of the sun into a single rope strong enough to pull a village through a year. When a child asked, "Who gave us the day?" an elder pointed skyward with 2 fingers, one for the sun, one for the bird that had carried it, and then turned his hand and pointed to the earth beneath their feet, because the earth had asked for day and had made room for it. Raven heard that answer and did not correct it. He shook water from his feathers and rose into light that loved him enough to show every wet drop leaving him like jewels. He climbed until the world looked stitched, and then he rested on the air, feeling the sun on his back and the cool promise of shadow under his wings. Between those two, brightness and shade, he had helped the world find its balance. He would, in other tellings, tip it again and again, because that is what tricksters do. But for now, the balance held, and the creatures under the new sun walked, flew, swam, hunted, slept, played, and dreamed in a radiance that did not explain itself and never needed to.
The sun had not only changed how people lived, it had changed how they remembered. In the long darkness before, memory was a fragile thread. Without light, faces blurred, places dissolved, and the voices of ancestors faded quickly like smoke lost in the wind. But under the sun, memory began to grow roots. A face could be seen clearly. A place could be marked by stone. A story could be told not just in words, but in gestures that matched the new shadows. So people began to gather, not only to survive, but to honor. Out of survival came ceremony. The first ceremonies were simple. Small circles of fire, hands raised to the sky, words spoken softly. Gratitude sent upward like smoke lost in the wind. But under the sun, memory began to grow roots. A face could be seen clearly. A place could be marked by stone. A story could be told not just in words, but in gestures that matched the new shadows. So people began to gather, not only to survive, but to honor. Out of survival came ceremony. The first ceremonies were simple. Small circles of fire, hands raised to the sky, words spoken softly. Gratitude sent upward like smoke lost in the wind. But the sun encouraged growth as surely in spirit as in soil. Soon, ceremonies became longer, richer, filled with color and sound, with gesture and meaning. When the first harvest of berries ripened under the warmth of midsummer, the people gathered in the meadow. They picked the berries carefully, placing the first handful not in their mouths, but on a carved wooden plate.
The plate was lifted high toward the sun, its red fruit glowing like drops of blood against the sky. An elder spoke. "These are not ours alone. They are the earth's, they are the animals, they are the sun's." Then the plate was placed upon a stone, and the children were told to watch as birds came and pecked the offering. When the birds flew away, the people began to eat, laughing as the sweetness burst upon their tongues. That was the first berry ceremony, and every summer it returned. Later, when salmon filled the rivers, the people held the first fish ceremony. A young fisherman, chosen for his patience and respect, caught the first salmon of the season. He lifted it carefully from the water, cradling it like a child. Women sang a low song, their voices weaving with the sound of the river. The salmon was roasted whole, its skin crackling in the firelight. And before anyone tasted, a piece was returned to the river, given back, so that the water would never forget its children. The rest was shared among all, from elders to infants, each tasting not only food, but promise. Ceremonies grew around birth. When a child was born, the people no longer hid in fear of darkness. They welcomed the child into daylight. A newborn was held up at dawn, its tiny body washed in the first rays of morning. Women smeared ash upon the child's forehead to remind it of night, then honey upon its lips to promise sweetness. Elders spoke blessings into its ears. "May you see long. May you walk in warmth. May you never forget that light is both gift and burden." Marriages, too, were transformed. In the old darkness, joining two lives had been a quiet act, private, whispered. Now, under the sun, marriage became public, celebrated. Two stood facing one another, their shadows touching the earth like clasped hands before their bodies did. A rope of woven grass was tied around their wrists, and they walked together in a circle as drums beat softly, imitating the heartbeat of the world. At the circle's end, they shared berries and water, symbols of sweetness and endurance. People threw handfuls of petals and leaves, not for decoration, but for meaning. The petals would wither, the leaves would fall, but love, like the sun, would return.
Even death received new ceremony. Before, the dead had been laid in shadow, their memory fragile. Now, when someone passed, their body was placed upon a high platform, lifted toward the sun. The people painted the face with red ochre, as if to remind it of the dawn. They sang songs that rose like smoke, carrying the soul upward. And when the bones remained, they were gathered gently, washed in river water, and placed in carved boxes lined with feathers. These boxes were not hidden in dark caves. They were placed where light could touch them, where moss would grow over them slowly, where generations could return and say, "This is where the sun touched our ancestor last." As ceremonies multiplied, so too did art. People painted with colors ground from stone, red from iron, yellow from ochre, white from shells, black from charcoal. They painted spirals, circles, hands, suns. They carved animals into wood, not just as likeness, but as presence. The salmon carved upon a pole meant the salmon itself was invited to the gathering. Songs lengthened, with verses that described not only what happened, but how it felt. The heat of the sun, the gleam of fish, the sound of rain on leaves. And always, Raven watched. He perched upon poles during weddings, cocking his head as if to laugh at human promises. He circled above funerals, his shadow crossing the painted faces of the dead. He strutted into berry fields, stealing a fruit or two from the offering plate before the birds could arrive. People smiled
and did not chase him away. They said, "It is only right. Without him, we would have none of this." Children began to wear small raven feathers tied in their hair during ceremonies. They said it made Raven laugh, and when Raven laughed, the sun seemed brighter. Elders nodded, saying, "Yes, let him laugh, for tricksters are keepers of balance, and without laughter, ceremony becomes stone." One summer, during the berry ceremony, a child asked, "Will the sun always return if we forget to honor it?" The elder paused and then answered, "The sun does not need us. It rises because that is its way. But we need the ceremonies. Without them, we forget who we are beneath its light." Raven heard this answer and gave a sharp, approving call. The people looked up, smiling, and some said they saw him wink. Thus, ceremonies became the heartbeat of the people, weaving their lives to the rhythm of the seasons, binding them not only to the sun, but to one another.
When the people had lived many seasons beneath the sun, when their ceremonies had deepened, and their children had grown up knowing no world without day, a quiet question began to ripple through the village. It came in whispers around fires, in the stillness before dawn, in the moments when hunters sat on ridges and watched the sun rise once more. The question was simple: what is the meaning of the light? At first, no one answered. Light was obvious. It warmed, it revealed, it fed. Yet the question returned, persistent, because human hearts always ask not only what, but why. One elder said, "The light is a gift from Raven. It is his trick, his treasures stolen for us." Another said, "The light belongs to the sun itself, and the sun belongs to no one. It rises because it must." A younger hunter, staring at his hands, murmured, "The light is so we may see each other, so we may know we are not alone." But still, the question lingered. It was then that a man, older than most but not yet an elder, began to speak differently. He was not known for hunting, nor for singing, nor for carving. His gift was silence. He sat often by the river, listening to the water, and when he spoke, people leaned close because his words were rare. He said, "The light is not only a gift, it is a teacher. It shows us the world, yes, but it also shows us ourselves. Before the light, we stumbled in dark. We touched, but did not see. We guessed, but did not know. The sun has revealed not only trees and rivers, but the shape of our own hearts." The people nodded, but he was not finished. "Yet do not forget," he continued, "that darkness is still with us. It has not vanished. Night comes, shadows stretch, clouds gather, winter storms cover the sky. Darkness is not our enemy, it is our memory. Without it, light would be empty." These words traveled through the village slow at first, then swiftly. Elders considered them. Children repeated them in their games. Hunters carried them into the forest. And Raven, perched above, listened with keen eyes. As years turned, people began to notice how shadow itself was a kind of teacher. At noon, when the sun was highest, a man stood and looked at his shadow, short, dark, clinging. At dawn and dusk, his shadow stretched long, leading him or following him depending on the hour. Children laughed, chasing their shadows, trying to step upon them, learning the playful truth that shadow was both theirs and not theirs. In ceremonies, shadows became part of the dance.
Firelight cast figures upon the walls of lodges, and people said the ancestors were joining them, moving with them. Hunters studied shadows on rocks and knew where prey had passed. Weavers used shadows to judge the tightness of their threads. Shadows spoke if one knew how to listen. And so the people came to see that Raven had given them not only light, but also balance. In stealing the sun, he had not erased the dark. He had bound the two together.
One evening, as the philosopher sat by the river, Raven landed near him. The bird tilted his head, black eyes glimmering, feathers catching the fading gold of sunset. "Why do you sit so still?" Raven asked, though his beak barely moved. The man smiled. "Because stillness lets me hear." "Hear what?" Raven demanded. "The world," the man answered. "The water, the trees, the fire in the sky. And sometimes I hear myself." Raven ruffled his feathers. "Do you also hear me?" "Yes," the man said softly. "I hear you most of all." Raven laughed, a harsh, beautiful sound. "And what do you think of me then? Am I a thief, a trickster, a hero?" The man looked at him steadily. "You are balance. You bring what we need, not always what we want. You remind us that gifts are dangerous, and dangers are gifts. Without you, we would have no day. Without your cunning, we would have no wisdom." Raven was pleased. He hopped closer, dipped his beak into the river, and drank. Then he spread his wings, and as he rose, the man thought he saw both light and shadow in those feathers, mingled so closely that they could never be torn apart. As more seasons passed, the people grew wise in their ceremonies. They no longer feared the return of winter, for they trusted the cycle. They no longer trembled at storms, for they knew calm would follow. Children grew up learning that every joy carried weight, and every sorrow carried meaning. When a hunter fell ill and died, the people mourned, but they also celebrated his shadow. They said, "He walked long upon the earth. His shadow stretched across rivers and mountains. Now it joins the great shadow that covers us all at night." When a child was born, they did not only praise the sunlight upon its face. They whispered also, "May you never fear the dark. May you rest in it, dream in it, and rise again." Thus the people lived with a wisdom that joined opposites, day and night, laughter and grief, gift and loss. Raven did not disappear into legend. He remained, always near, always watching. Sometimes he stole food. Sometimes he scattered shells on the beach. Sometimes he cawed so loudly at dawn that sleepers groaned and threw sticks at him. But people did not curse him. They smiled and said, "He reminds us not to sleep too heavily. He reminds us that life itself is a trick." On winter nights, when the moon was bright, people told the story of how Raven stole the sun. They told it slowly, with pauses, with laughter at his cunning, and sighs at his boldness. And at the end, they always added, "He is still among us. He still teaches us. Watch the shadows, listen to the wind, and you will hear him." Children drifted to sleep to the sound of this story, dreaming of wings that could carry both dark and light. And so the world continued. The sun rose and fell, seasons turned, rivers swelled and shrank, people were born, people died, laughter echoed, tears fell. But always in the hearts of the people there remained the memory of Raven, and with it the lesson.
Light without shadow blinds. Shadow without light suffocates. Together, they make the world whole. The philosopher, near the end of his life, sat once more by the river. His hair was white, his hands thin, his eyes dim. Yet he smiled as he watched the sun sink. "I am ready," he whispered, "for light has taught me to see, and shadow has taught me to rest." A raven landed beside him, silent this time. The bird did not speak, nor did the man. They sat together, watching the river gleam one last time. When the sun slid beneath the horizon and night returned, the man closed his eyes. His shadow remained long upon the ground, then vanished into the great dark that covers us all. The raven lifted his wings and flew into the twilight, neither only dark nor only light, but both, forever both.